Hi everyone, this is Isaac from IlluminatiWatcher.com, and you are listening to the Conspiracy Theories and Unpopular Culture podcast. Today our guest is an expert on the music industry, and he has recently written a book that exposed the agenda of the Illuminati. Now, of course, most of you already know when I say the Illuminati, I'm not referencing specifically the Bavarian Illuminati, but I am talking about a secret cabal, a certain effort being used to take music from its original form and intent and pervert it into this message of control and deceit. Our guest knows this more than anybody. He's been a DJ for several years. He's been all over the world. He's based out of the UK, and he recently took all of his music journalism and wrote a book called The Musical Truth, which he'll be talking about in this podcast. I know you're really going to love this. Enjoy. It'll be a good time. I promise you, especially if you've read lots of my articles on the music industry or my hip-hop book. This guy, he knows a lot about hip-hop, and he emphasizes that in the book. But he also goes into rock music, classic rock, some of the UK figures. It's a fascinating read. I blew right through it. And I know if you've read my books, you'll appreciate his writing style as well, because he kind of doesn't BS around, and it makes for a real quick page turner. It's just a great book, and you really need to pick it up. But take a listen to the podcast, see what you think. So Mark, how's it been going?
Isaac, good to be with you, man. It's been busy, about to get busy. My book is now published. It's available via Amazon and other sources. And so I'm starting to do the rounds of radio interviews, and I'm about to go on a speaking tour as well, which is mainly dates in the UK. But I am coming to the US. I'm going to be at the Free Your Mind 4 conference just outside Philadelphia in April. That's the weekend of 15th to the 17th of April. So looking forward to getting back to the US. I don't get there often these days, but I'll have copies of the book with me there, and I'm doing a quick talk at the conference as well. So yeah, busy times, lots going on.
Oh, that's great. So this book took you, because I kind of follow you on social media, and you've been talking about this book for some time now.
Yeah.
And
Feels like a
kudos
lifetime.
for taking, yeah, exactly, because when I wrote my hip hop book, it took me forever, and then I saw you were kind of taking on the entire music industry, so kudos for taking that on.
It does take a minute.
Because there's a lot of ground to cover, and
oh yeah,
when I read through your book, I think you nailed it, man. I think you hit everything there is to hit.
Well, thank you. That was certainly the intention. I mean, it's a rabbit hole, as you well know, to use a well-worn phrase. But you start investigating one particular subject area, and it leads you off in many different other tangents, and so you start exploring other areas, and then that dovetails off into other connected areas, and before you know it, you've just got this labyrinth of different subject areas, but which are all connected ultimately, and they all feed into the big picture. And you realise that if you want to give people a complete overview of everything that's going on, you've got to go to all these places that you're taken to, and you've got to spend the time investigating them and putting the information across as clearly as you can. And that is a very time-consuming process, as I discovered. I didn't have any idea this book would take so long to write. I didn't have any idea it would turn out to be so big and have so many chapters. But I think to do this whole subject justice, you have to go to all these different places, and that was a real revelation to me.
I got to be honest with you, just because you're a friend and a guest on the show, I'm not blowing smoke at you, but your writing style is awesome because it's very easy to read. And a lot of people I talk to who've read my books kind of have the same feedback. They say, I like the way you write because it's kind of, I don't want to say blog style, but it's very readable. It's not too kind of vague or anything. It's very to the point, and I think you have to have that when you're covering this much material, because when I read because I read books all the time. I've always got like 5 or 6 going at a time, and your book was one of those ones where it's literally hard to put down because you can just blow through this material, and it's just constantly new revelations, stuff that I didn't even know about is blowing my mind, and we'll get into that in a bit here, but
Yeah, well, thanks for that. That's the best kind of feedback I could have hoped for from the book, because all the best books that I've read have got me that way. You know, I can't put them down. I read them over several days and nights in one go, and you just want to see what happens on the next page. So for anyone to say that about my book is a compliment indeed, and I certainly appreciate that. That was always the intention anyway.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. The beginning sections, you kind of go through your awakening process.
Yeah.
And you list some of the same kind of pivotal figures that I've kind of attributed to help wake me up, David Icke and Graham Hancock and whatnot.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting that you also kind of dabbled in atheism a little bit.
Oh, for sure. I went through a long period of atheism. I've been through different kind of belief systems in my life, really. I was raised as not really a Christian as such. I mean, my parents were never religious, but the schools that I went to were Church of England schools. And so they kind of foisted the Christianity thing on us. And we went to church at certain key points in the year. And we were taught all about Jesus and God. And we learnt certain biblical passages and stuff. And I just thought that was normal. I just thought that was a part of what you do at school. And once I left school, I didn't really have any kind of religious leanings at all. And something kind of happened to me when I was age 19, just about to be 20. And I started to feel differently about the world, and I started to feel like there were some truths that I needed to discover. And I couldn't work out what was happening to me. And looking back on it with hindsight, I think it was an awakening of the sort that I eventually received in 2010. But this was 20 years earlier. This was in 1990. And there was something about that year and those times that was really special. And a lot of people seem to have been tapping into it and picking up on it. I mean, if you read the books of David Icke, he talks about the fact that in March 1990, he had this experience where he was in the bookstore in the Isle of Wight, and he got guided to this particular book. And it ended up in him going to see this medium, and that just set him on his long path towards what he went on to do. And there are many other authors and researchers that talk about something in 1990, in those times, that they were kind of tapping into. It was vibrations, it was changes, you know. And I think I was feeling that, but I didn't realise what it was, and I didn't know what to do with it. And so the only kind of answer that was open to me was to go into the Christian church. And I had an aunt at the time who was quite a devout Christian. And I spoke to her about the way I was feeling. And she said, oh, you know, God's calling you. You've got to come into the church. This is wonderful. And so I allowed myself to be brought into this evangelical Christian church. And I stayed there for the next 4 years. But I never felt totally comfortable with it. And throughout the time that I spent there, I had more questions than answers, because all the stuff that I was hearing about in church every Sunday just raised a whole bunch of questions in my mind, and it didn't kind of add up, and I couldn't reconcile all these things. I've always been someone that sought answers to things, and I just wasn't getting them. And I left that church very disillusioned 4 years later. And because I'd not got the answers, and because I saw a whole load of hypocrisy in the church, I saw people talking about living your life a certain way, but not walking the talk, not doing it themselves. That sent me down a path of quite bitter atheism. You know, it had the opposite effect on me. I thought, well, you know, there's nothing to this religious, spiritual stuff. I guess there is no higher power after all, and we're all just here as kind of cosmic accidents on this rock floating in space. And so I had that worldview for many years, and I started looking at the work of the likes of Richard Dawkins and, you know, other famous atheists. And that was pretty much my worldview until around 2007, 2008, which was the beginnings of my awakening. And that's when I started looking at the books of David Icke, and other authors came across my radar. And then my awakening, which I detail in the opening section of the book, occurred in 2010. And so that's where I've been for the last 5 or 6 years. That's the path I'm now on. So I've had these different kind of belief systems and paradigms throughout my life. But I think all of them happened because they were meant to. You know, I'm where I am now because I went through those processes. I think it was all part of the plan, and it was all intended to be that way.
I'd like to know your feelings on this, but my perspective on this kind of thing is I've also I wouldn't say I was into atheism per se, but I was raised in kind of a Christian church environment, but I wasn't really feeling it. But I feel like the music and the films influenced me to be drawn to the dark side, so to speak.
Hmm.
And I feel like obviously music and films have an influence on us as much as there's a myth that it does not. Like for instance, out here in the U.S., we had the Columbine shootings that were allegedly influenced by Marilyn Manson, and there was this huge debate, and the media was sure to take the message of, oh, music can't make anybody do anything. But I find that to be the contrary, because you and I both kind of listen to a lot of hip hop, and in the 90s, like you said, at the beginning of the 90s, rap music was much different than it was at the late 90s and early 2000s. Because like the mid 90s, we got the gangster rap stuff, which you talk about in the book.
Yeah.
And then after that, it got even more commercialized. And whenever you see some kind of commercialization of a product, you have to understand and know that there's a puppet master in there who's doing this to make money, or they're doing it to push their agenda or their message. So I'm curious if you think that music is capable of influencing us to do as far as even acts of evil.
Well, I think it is, with the benefit of having done the research and with the benefit of maturity. I mean, I think there's something to be said for reaching the point in life that I'm now at, because you get to an age where you're able to reflect and muse on things, and you don't have any kind of ulterior motive or agenda or axe to grind. And what I mean by that is when you're in your 20s and you're, coming up in the game and trying to make a name for yourself, maybe as a DJ, or you're just trying to fit into a certain scene and you're into hip hop, let's say, you want to fit in with your peers, with friends, with other people who are part of that scene. And so you just kind of go with the flow, and you allow yourself to be swept along with whatever the fashions are and whatever the trends are and whatever way that particular scene is going. And so when you hear things at that kind of age, like music can have an influence on human behaviour, and it can affect your perceptions and your thoughts and dictate your moods and emotions, you're liable to write it off as BS, because you just want to go with the crowd and go with the flow and just be a part of things. And that throws a real spanner in the works if you kind of acknowledge the fact that music could be having that kind of effect on you. It's the same thing with movies. I remember when I was quite young, we had this term here in the UK called video nasties. And this was when, VHS videos really took off and kind of took over from cinema. And everyone was watching movies at home because video recorders were brand new on the scene. And there were all these horror movies and kind of exploitation, sensationalist, sex and violence movies, which were portrayed by the media at the time as video nasties. And they were saying, oh, these are having an effect on kids, and they're causing people to go out and do certain behaviours and live certain lifestyles. And I wrote that off at the time as a load of nonsense, because I didn't see any foundation to it. But as I say, I've now had an opportunity to do the research and look into this whole vast subject area. And I've come to understand that absolutely images that you see on screen that go straight into your subliminal mind can have an effect on your moods, behaviours and actions. And also stuff that you hear in records can do the same. Because the key to it is that it's all aimed at the subliminal mind. And this is below the threshold of conscious thought and conscious analysis. And this is where the language of symbols lives. And your subconscious mind is absorbing symbolic images all the time without you being aware that it's going on. The subliminal mind absorbs several million pieces of information per second, but the conscious mind is only capable of processing a small proportion of that information. So only a small amount of it gets drawn into the conscious mind where you're aware that it's actually going on. The rest of it gets lodged away there in the subconscious, and it can come out later in terms of perceptions and behaviours and thoughts that you've picked up. And you don't realise it's happening. And the puppet masters, the controllers of the entertainment industry, who are in charge of Hollywood movies and the television industry and, of course, the corporate music industry, are only too aware of this effect. And they use it to their own ends all the time in terms of stuff that they splice into music videos and movies and even promotional photo shoots and record sleeves and things like that. They're doing it all the time, and people just aren't aware that it's happening. So absolutely, it's real. I can understand why people don't want to acknowledge that, but when you get into it and you do the research and you approach it with an open mind, I don't see how you can come to any other conclusion.
And that's why I think this book that you wrote is so important, because it's able to kind of come at it from the rational beginner's perspective even, and even for people that are more seasoned in this kind of conspiracy stuff. It provides a way of making people understand what's going on. And if nothing else, even if you were to read this book, you would at the bare minimum come away with the idea that, wow, there really is something going on. That's very odd how many things connect in here.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you the approach that I really wanted to take with the book. I kept in mind the whole time that I wanted to reach a whole bunch of people that ordinarily wouldn't look at quote-unquote conspiracy issues or truth and consciousness type information. And I had in mind the fact that throughout my career as a DJ, I've come into contact with a lot of people, other DJs, people that work at record companies and promotional companies and other organisations within the music industry, just people that have come to gigs, people that have listened to my radio shows. And I had this group of people in mind when I was writing the book, because I thought this is a great opportunity to wake large numbers of people up to some great truths about what's going on in this world. Crucial information that we really all need to be paying attention to, because it affects everyone alive on Earth today and all of our families. And if you come at these a lot of these people with blatant kind of conspiracy type information, a lot of them are just going to switch off, because there's this whole stigma about conspiracy theorists. People that bring truthful information into the public realm are demonized, as we know, systematically by the mainstream media. And there's kind of this stereotype of us as nutters and lunatics and just these mad people that like to rant and rave about crazy stuff. And so I wanted to think about other ways that you can get that kind of information to people, but make them come to it and make them want to discover it for themselves. And talking about what goes on in popular culture, and particularly in the music industry, is a great way of showing how the stuff that is relevant to that scene ties into the bigger picture of what's really going on in this world and what this world is anyway. We get right down to the very nature of reality and how it can be manipulated and how everything is made up of energy and vibration and frequencies, but that's a very deep subject area for somebody to come into that has not studied it at all, So the way you bring them in is by talking about stuff that is going on in Jay-Z videos and Kanye West videos and stuff that's happening with Rihanna and Beyonce. And so you can get a whole generation of people that are interested in these artists. And the minute you mention that there's some dark occult satanic stuff going on with their videos and their music, that is going to make people's ears prick up, and it's going to make them pay attention. Even if their first instinct is to say, you're talking bollocks, mate, this is all rubbish, at least you've engaged them into looking at it. And there's a chance that they might look at what you've got to say and then be led into other areas of discovery. And it's not just that generation and those names that it can have this effect with. I'm talking in the book about stuff related to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Doors and Elvis Presley even, and many of the artists that came out of that Laurel Canyon counterculture hippie scene at the tail end of the 60s. And, I'm mentioning John Lennon and Bob Marley, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston in the section where I go into strange deaths of rock stars. And so there's something for every generation there. There's something for people in their 60s and 70s that remember the 60s and the Beatles and stuff. And they're going to want to find out more once you kind of pique their interest with the odd little soundbite here and there. So the intention always was to draw people in with the music industry stuff in recognition of the fact that everyone loves some kind of music. Everyone's got some favourite artist. And, you can show how pretty much every scene that there's been on both sides of the Atlantic is a part of the agenda that I'm discussing in the book. And then once you've got people on that basis, hopefully their natural curiosity will lead them into wanting to know how it dovetails and fits into everything else that's going on. And that's something I've attempted to do in the book. And that's one of the reasons why it's so bloody big. 170,000 words, 536 pages, because I don't see how you can tell this story in anything less if you're going to go everywhere that it takes you, to be honest.
That's a great example of how deep this rabbit hole goes, because like you were saying, we're most people are familiar with at least the idea that Beyonce is in the Illuminati because she does the rock diamond triangle at the Super Bowl. I've heard people say this at my workplace, who, by the way, don't know I'm into any of this, because you're right, there is a stigma attached to it, which
for sure.
Whoever has successfully instilled since the JFK assassination.
Well, that's right.
But what's funny is that MTV, VH1, a lot of these kind of mainstream websites will have started to write articles about how a certain performance was an act of the Illuminati, and then they write up this half-assed, jokingly mocking kind of, I mean, there's no research involved whatsoever to it, to discredit the actual truth. And as is evident in your book with 170,000 words, it's not something that's simple to convey. It's not something that someone can just take in a 15-minute, YouTube video. There's a lot to it. And there seems to be some kind of attempt to, keep the conspiracy theorists down, so to speak.
Yeah.
So,
well, Illuminati has become a kind of catch-all convenient term used by the mainstream media. They love their little sound bites. They love to be able to categorize things. And so whenever you are talking about secret societies that are steeped in dark occult practices, Illuminati has come to be a kind of catch-all umbrella term for all of that. And certainly there's a case to be made for the idea that there is an organization to this day that are known as the Illuminati, but that's not the whole picture. We're talking about different groups and secret societies that are steeped in dark occult practices and rituals, and that are all adhering to this ancient religion, which is all about, when you get right down to it, worshipping Saturn, the dark influences of the planet Saturn. That seems to be the key to the belief systems of these various different groups and individuals that are controlling pretty much every aspect of what goes on Earth, and particularly what goes on at the corporate levels of the music industry. So to say that somebody like Beyonce or Jay-Z is in the Illuminati is missing the point by about 500 miles. They're not in anything. Right. The likes of Jay-Z, Beyonce, Rihanna, Kanye, all the rest of them are merely stooges and puppets that are used as assets by those that control these industries. It's no different with Obama or David Cameron or any of these other so-called world leaders. They're all stooges of the same control system. They're all working ultimately for the same paymasters. And we have these people paraded in front of us on TV as celebrities or politicians or whatever, to give the impression that they've got there off their own back and they're operating to their own agenda, whatever it may be, to hide the truth of the fact that these people are just paraded in front of us as the public face for this very insidious, malevolent agenda that's going on behind the scenes at all levels. So that's ultimately what it comes down to.
Yeah, you say that there's a section where you talk about power being consolidated by the elite who set the social norms. And you have a very interesting quote in there, and it's something to the effect of how when we bring up these theories about, let's say, the blood sacrifice theory, which you talk about in the book, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but, when you talk to when you talk to people who are not conspiracy theorists about this kind of thought, they say, oh, they would never do that. and you rightly say, no, we would never do that, because these people are in a whole different kind of sick, twisted, perverted environment where the idea of a blood sacrifice is acceptable. And in fact, it's been an ancient practice for thousands of years. And when we see the pagan influences of today, it's obvious that the ancient religion and the pagan religion is very well alive. And part of that involves blood sacrifice.
Yeah, well, people seem very ready to accept the fact that blood sacrifices did take place in ancient times, in ancient civilizations. You can talk to people about, the Aztecs or the Mayans or various other civilizations around the world, and people will be very ready to accept what is contained in history books about how they used to perform sacrifices to whatever gods or deities they believed in. But people seem to think that in these times in which we live, we're far more civilized now and advanced, and that sort of thing could never go on. But I wouldn't be so sure, because as you brought up there, and I mentioned in the book, a common misconception that people have is, oh, they'd never do that. All this horrific stuff that we hear goes on, child sacrifice and all of this, rituals, that would never happen. People would never do that. And it is the case that, the average Joe, the average person listening to this, I hope, would never do that sort of thing and would never be capable of it. But we're talking about individuals here who are deeply psychotic, mentally ill, psychopathic, and possessed of a satanic mindset. They've been born into this type of existence. It's a generational thing. The elites, so-called, like to keep control within certain bloodlines because they want to traumatize and mind control their own type from a very early age, so that they will grow up with a psychopathic mindset and approach to the world and to everything that they do. And so they would do this sort of thing all the time. It's daily business to them. It's a daily operation. And the other big misconception that people have is, oh, if this sort of stuff was going on in the world, the media would tell us about it. Well, of course they wouldn't if the mainstream media, all the big corporations, were ultimately owned and controlled by the same individuals and the same groups that are perpetrating this stuff in the first place. And another point that I make in the book is, I know that people scoff at conspiracy theories, so-called, and the idea that there could be this elite class that are trying to control and enslave and subjugate the rest of us. I know it's hard for people to accept, but just think for a minute about what you would do if you were one of these psychopathic elites and you were hell-bent on controlling everybody else in the world. Would you consolidate your position so that you owned and controlled all the governments of the world, so that you owned and controlled all the educational establishments, and therefore you dictated what gets taught in universities, colleges and schools around the world? You owned the military industrial complex and all the armies around the world. You owned and controlled all the big corporations, particularly the food and drink corporations, and not forgetting owning, controlling and directing the entertainment industry. Hollywood movies, TV programs, TV news, so-called, the mainstream media, and of course the corporate music business. Would you want to do all that if you wanted to control everyone on Earth? I think you probably would. I think that sounds like quite a plan. So why then is it so difficult for people to accept that that might just be exactly what has happened? And another sort of debunk that I discuss in the book as well, when people, because I come up against this all the time from people in everyday life that don't want to acknowledge that there's any kind of horrible, unpleasant, unwelcome stuff going on in the world. It's far easier just to labour under the delusion that everything's basically fine, everything's okay, the world is normal, and we can all carry on as we are. It's very difficult for people to want to rock the boat by acknowledging that the world could be slightly different to that. But something that I often say to people is, okay, I know you don't believe that any of this stuff is going on, but if it did, and if there were an elite class of psychopathic satanic controllers that had designs on enslaving you and your children, would you want to know about it? And the majority of people that you say that to, I would suggest, would come back at you and say, well, yeah, of course I would want to know. So then you go on to point out that is exactly what is going on right now in this reality, and it actually is affecting them and their children. They've just said they would want to know, so you're telling them it's happening, and they're still not having it. They'll still come back at you and say, "Oh no, that sounds a bit far-fetched to me. That doesn't sound right. That can't possibly be happening." People reject things on the basis of whether it sounds right or not.
Right, and that is cognitive dissonance you talk about in the book. It's the idea that these people, they're loyal subjects to the celebrities, and we all know that they call them idols and gods, and people act a damn fool when they see a celebrity that they worship. So they can't buy into that. They can't correlate that maybe that person that they worship and adore might not have their best interests in.
Yeah. It's bringing everything down to the personal ego of that individual, as if that's the ultimate arbiter of all truth. If they themselves, that particular individual, out of all 7 billion souls on the planet, don't believe that something could be true because it doesn't sound right to them, then that's it. That's the end of the debate. That's the truth as far as they're concerned. They're reducing everything down to what their own ego believes and thinks sounds appropriate, which is ridiculous when you think about it. You have to do the research. You have to look at the information. Now, I don't mind somebody coming to me, having looked at all the information I've put out, and debating certain points with me and saying, I don't agree with you with what you've said about Paul McCartney or the Beatles. I don't agree with you with your analysis of this Jay-Z video. I don't agree with what you have to say about Kanye, and here's why. Here's what my research has thrown up. Here are some points that I have some problems with. I don't have a problem with that, because that individual has looked at the information and has taken the time and trouble to actually study it, and hopefully has done so with an open mind. What I can't abide, and I'm sure it's the same for you and many other researchers that work in this field, is when you put information out there that you yourself have researched, you yourself believe to be true to the best ability that you have to think that way, and yet people just rubbish it immediately without even looking at what you've got to say, purely because it sounds ridiculous. And they won't engage in a debate with you because they don't want to be troubled with things like information and facts and evidence, but they'll just brush it off and not consider that it's something they want to look at, because to acknowledge that it is true would shatter their paradigm, and it might actually cause them to have to reassess their view of the world and their place in it. And a lot of people, it seems, just don't want to go there. It seems that people are either cut out for handling the truth or they're not. What's that famous line from the Jack Nicholson movie where he says, "You can't handle the truth"?
Mm-hmm.
It seems,
you good man.
Yeah, exactly. It seems that is the case when it comes to so much of this information. So it seems to be, Isaac, that there are many people that just will not embrace truthful information in this lifetime because they're just not equipped or built or willing enough to take it on board. And there are other individuals that do want truth, and when they're led to certain information, it will resonate with them and they will want to know more. So, all we can really do is put out information that we understand to be truthful, put out information that we think is important for people to take on board, and then it's over to them. It's down to them what they do with it.
And we're battling the same thing here, you and I. We both, because you made mention of this particular thing in the book, and this is something I've been researching pretty heavily the last maybe 6 months to a year. It's this dogma of science. And I actually, I've got a master's in science, so like science and engineering is my thing. But the truth of the matter is we've got this culture now that says, well, if you can't scientifically prove something to me, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And that couldn't be further from the truth, because in science we learned a lot about like the evolution and revolution of theories. And the way it works is we just saw this happen with Einstein's gravitational waves being proved as true. What that did was that shattered part of Isaac Newton's theories of gravity by proving Einstein's theory of relativity. So you see, the thing keeps tweaking, which tells me that science, where it's at currently, is not the absolute truth. It will always keep evolving. And people kind of, in their head, they can't get in modern day times, if you can't prove it scientifically, they don't think it exists, which is part of the agenda, is to destroy spirituality and the idea that being of a hidden realm, which is ironic because a lot of these occultists like Aleister Crowley and Kenneth Anger, which you talk about in the book, they believe wholeheartedly in this kind of extraterrestrial, otherworldly, dimensional entities, and it's part and parcel to the occult agenda. But people, it's almost like they're dangling the carrot over in one direction while they're practicing ritual magic on the other.
Yeah, well, scientism is another religion, and it's linked to atheism. And if they don't get you one way, they get you another, which is something I also get into in the book. You know, the controllers that have been running the show in this world for far too long have taken over and hijacked all the main world religions, and they've steered them off in a certain direction. And as far as I can tell, all these major world religions that we're all familiar with, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism or anything else, at their core, they all have great spiritual truths and understandings about the true nature of the universe and our place here. That's the common core of all of them. But over vast periods of time, each of them has had a whole load of dogma attached to it, and rules and regulations about what you can do, what you can't do, what's allowed, what's not. And it's been written into the various holy books, and it's been seized upon as a method of controlling large numbers of people by, you know, certain political systems and certain organisations that have come to take over these religions. So there is some great spiritual truth at the very core of all of them, as I say, but they've been steered off in a certain direction. And the reason they've done this is because they recognise that there's this innate leaning within the human soul and the human psyche towards spiritual understandings, and we are kind of equipped and conditioned to seek out spirituality and to explore it while we're here in human form. So that's the reason they've co-opted and controlled all these religions, because they want that seeking of spirituality to be under controlled conditions, with them doing the controlling. But they also recognise that there are many people that will reject all this stuff, and they'll get sent off down a path of atheism instead. And that's exactly what happened with me. You know, it was a kind of rebellious reaction on my part to all the hypocrisy that I thought I'd seen in this Christian church that sent me off on the path to atheism. And for people that choose to go down that path, they've got them as well, because that's where scientism comes in, and that's where the Richard Dawkins brand of atheism, you know, there is no higher power, we're just here to make the best of it for ourselves. That's where all that comes in. So that's why I say if they don't get you one way, they get you another. But what I really love is when you've got people from scientific, academic backgrounds that have all the qualifications, and they went to university and stuff, but they are actually prepared to use all this, all their analytical capabilities to look into truth and to go wherever it takes them with an open mind. And I get into the subject of the replacement of Paul McCartney, as people may be aware. Bit of a hobby horse of mine. It is mentioned in the book. There's about 12,000 words on the subject. No, 15,000 words, actually. I think you just got to that chapter. That is really one that meets with extreme reactions from people. The minute you mention the suggestion that the original Paul McCartney could have been replaced, people get very, very upset and very passionate about it. But nevertheless, you know, I would invite people to read what's in the book, and I'm far from the only author and researcher that's got into this subject area. And the reason I mention it is because there's a guy in the US who I'm sure many of your listeners will be aware of by the name of Professor Jim Fetzer. And he's a radio show host and, you know, a writer and researcher now. And he was formerly in the US Marines, and he's also got a strong academic background as well. And he is one of the most vocal proponents of the idea that the original Paul McCartney was actually replaced. And he put out a book a short while ago called And I Suppose We Didn't Go to the Moon Either, where he's collated a number of essays about various conspiracy theories, so to speak. And then there's a guy in the UK by the name of Dr. Nick Colostrom. and I did a podcast with him recently as well on the subject of the McCartney replacement, and he also is a former university professor that was actually kicked out of his job in the University of London for suggesting that the official narrative of the Jewish Holocaust may be grossly exaggerated. You know, that is a real touchy area, and that is definitely going to get you into a lot of trouble with certain authorities if you dare to go there. And sure enough, he was kicked out of his job. But with Jim Fetzer and Nick Kollerstrom, you've got a couple of guys that come from these academic scientific backgrounds that have actually looked at the evidence, the forensic evidence and the facts, as well as the symbolic clues regarding McCartney, and they've come to the conclusion that yes, this guy was replaced, because the evidence speaks for itself, the forensics speak for themselves, and when you view it from that perspective, there is no other conclusion you can come up with. So I love it when people from these academic backgrounds that are part of the establishment, effectively the control system, are able to see through the BS and use the skills that they've picked up through their lives and apply it to a situation and come to a conclusion that goes against the official narrative. It just, you know, it's a testament to the power of logic and just going where the truth takes you.
In the book, you start out with basically the beginning of pop music with the Beatles, like you mentioned, and it kind of transitions through to all the way up to modern times, and you dabble into rock music, hip-hop, mind control, predictive programming, sort of every kind of theory that's out there surrounding these things. And what I really liked was the sections where you're talking about the artists from the UK, because I'm from the US and I'm not very familiar with some of these artists and celebrities that you've pointed out their tie-ins with, like, kind of a pedophilia rings. And as disturbing as it is, you know, you drop the names like Jimmy Savile, who I was familiar with who that is, but it's not a household name particularly in the U.S.
Right.
You kind of go through his background and link him in with this kind of spider web that includes Simon Cowell, who I'm also familiar with. Yeah. But you go to the heavy hitters. You talk about the Beatles, John Lennon, Elton John, The Who. And that whole thing was fascinating to me, because I'm not familiar with those theories. I've heard them I've heard in passing about how Paul is dead, but I didn't know much about it. So you gave me an awesome springboard from which, you know, the reader can take and kind of delve into the thing. But you go into the Paul conspiracy pretty heavy.
Yeah, pretty much.
So that must resonate with you. You think that Paul is not dead then?
Yeah, I remember hearing this particular one years and years ago, probably 25, 30 years ago, and like most people, the minute I heard the suggestion that the real Paul McCartney was dead and was replaced by an imposter, I just wrote it off as complete nonsense. Can't possibly be true, sounds ridiculous, don't even give it any further thought. And I remember at the time, somebody had mentioned that the sleeve to the Beatles' Abbey Road album, with the Beatles walking across this zebra crossing and Paul being barefoot in this shabby sort of loose-fitting suit, was symbolic of the fact that he was a corpse, and this was what was trying to be conveyed by this album sleeve. And I wrote it off as ridiculous. But when I started researching the information for this book, and this started about 5 years ago, this particular conspiracy theory came back across my radar, and I was able to look at it with fresh eyes and from a renewed perspective, and with an understanding of many other things. And the two main things that I bore in mind throughout were the fact that the controllers that we're talking about, that run these industries and everything else, love their symbolism. And one of the things they seem to feel the need to do is to place representations of what they're doing right there in plain sight. They do it in veiled, coded form. They do it using symbolism and using numerology. And it's only really those with the eyes to see that understand the language of symbolism that are going to be able to interpret what's being put across. But nevertheless, they still feel the need to convey this information in this way. And when you understand that this is a central tenet of what they do, and when you also understand that, unfortunately, I wish it was some other way, I didn't create this, I'm just commenting on it. Unfortunately, these individuals and these groups, their activities are steeped in various dark occult rituals, and that includes sacrifices from time to time. And when you bear these aspects in mind, you're able to address this whole subject area from a very informed perspective. So that's the thing with the McCartney replacement.
Well, you said something interesting about John Lennon that I didn't. Like I said before, I'm not super well versed in the Beatles and their history, but he left a quote that said, "Only queers and Jews can get on in showbiz," and that's interesting coming from the guy who was, such a hippie and kind of had these kind of peaceful notions about the world. For him to say something like that, I feel like that must have been must have left a bad taste in his mouth for some reason.
Well, that's a quote that was attributed to Lennon. There are many other fascinating quotes that he came up with. One of them was when he said there are only 100 people in the world that understand our music. And he said that at the point that the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album was released. And the sleeve to that is one of the most enigmatic and fascinating record sleeves ever. You could spend days analysing the artwork to that and what's trying to be symbolically conveyed through it. And I think in 1967 there probably were only 100 people in the world that would have understood all that stuff. But here we are 50 years later with the internet and with the availability of information and with a great understanding of symbolism and the workings of the dark occult and what's really going on in the world. And I would suggest there's rather more than 100 people now that are starting to understand all this stuff. And, it's probably up into the hundreds of thousands in terms of who can understand what's being conveyed with this stuff. But just taking it back to that quote from Lennon, when I started looking at the early days of the music industry, when I first started researching this stuff, I got pulled into it, to be honest, with all the Jay-Z and Kanye and Beyonce and, Katy Perry and Miley Cyrus and Britney Spears. And I did tend to think that it was a fairly modern phenomenon. It was a product of the 2000s, all this dark occult stuff that was going on, or these indications of the music industry being utterly controlled by these sinister corporations. I did make the mistake of thinking it was a relatively modern thing. But the more I looked into it, the more I realised it just goes way back to the very early days and the very foundation of the music industry on both sides of the Atlantic. And, it ties into the early years of Elvis Presley, and on the British scene it goes right back to Cliff Richard. There's a name we can get into, and the Beatles. And there was this fascinating article that I came across, which was written by a former British intelligence operative who went by the name of T. Stokes. And it was expanded upon by a British writer by the name of Chris Spivey on his website. And this article is just this amazing interconnected labyrinth of links between prominent music industry artists of the 1960s or the 50s and 60s and prominent MPs of the time, establishment figures, the Cray twins, these notorious gangsters from 1960s London. It ties into paedophilia, it ties into ritual sacrifice, it ties into satanic ritual abuse. It goes right up to the very highest levels of the establishment. And this guy T. Stokes has weaved together all these different threads and showed how all these different characters are ultimately connected in a synchronistic way. And the common threads throughout are always links to military intelligence, such as MI5, MI6, and other Secret Service organisations. Links to paedophilia and child abuse, which is an ever-present spectre in the early days of the industry. Individuals who refer to themselves as Jewish. Now, I know the minute you start talking about that, some people's antenna will go up and they'll start saying, oh, he must be anti-Semitic if he's talking about Jewish people. No, right. Not anti-Semitic when you're stating facts. And when you get down to the backgrounds of a very large number of the key players in the music industry and tying into the TV and film industry from the early days of those industries going right forward to present day, you find that an above average proportion of them just happen to be Jewish or refer to themselves as Jewish. And this is a point which people don't seem to want to discuss because it's controversial, it's not politically correct, because of the way we've been programmed to think about these things. But I make the point in the book that if such a large and out of proportion number of people controlling a particular industry happen to be, let's say, Portuguese or Malaysian or Icelandic or Finnish, people would find it unusual. And they would say, why are so many Icelandic people in this particular industry? But when it comes down to Jewish people, because we're not supposed to talk about it, people don't tend to ask the question. And I think it is a valid question. What's the key here? Why do Jewish backgrounds keep popping up in this interconnected story? There's also a wildly out of proportion number of homosexuals. And again, that's something that tends to be a touchy subject. People start to get upset about it. I'm merely stating the facts. If you look at the overall population of any given country, the number of individuals that would identify themselves as homosexual would be very, very low as a percentage. And yet a massive percentage of those running these industries or involved in them happen to identify themselves as homosexual. I think it's a valid question to ask why that should be. So those are some common threads. Military intelligence is always there. Jewish/homosexual backgrounds. There's always paedophilia lurking not far behind the scene. And you know who else is never far from the scene when it comes to this interconnected web? Our old mate Aleister Crowley.
Oh yeah, always, huh?
The notorious occultist Aleister Crowley. His various works through the different secret societies, or occult societies, I should say, that he was a part of, the OTO, the AA, the Golden Dawn, and all the rest of them, are never far from the surface. And there are so many music artists from through the years that have expressed an absolute fascination with the occult workings and teachings of Aleister Crowley. It feeds into the story of the Beatles. It goes into the Rolling Stones big time. David Bowie, who we just lost, was a devotee of Aleister Crowley. Elton John has talked about him. Even Jay-Z, with his famous Do What Thou Wilt sweatshirt, which is from Aleister Crowley's Book of the Law, one of the central tenets of his Thelema philosophy, would appear to be infatuated with Crowley. So Crowley is everywhere. And I think if you did a count of the name that crops up more than any other in my book, you'd probably find it's Aleister Crowley. And why should that be? Why should that be in the music industry, which is supposed to be all about entertainment, letting your hair down, having a good time, forgetting all about your worries, That's all music is supposed to be. It's just supposed to be this fun, leisurely activity. Why is this notorious dark occultist, Satanist, that was into all manner of dark, ritualistic activities, why is he everywhere? Why should that be? Is that not a valid question?
Yeah, and I think that when you get into that inner circle of these top-level celebrities and entertainers, there must be some kind of conveyance of the importance of this guy, because you're right, how does this guy show up so many times? And you had a section about Elton John in the book, and I had no idea he was into Crowley, automatic writing.
Oh yeah.
His co-writer said he was had like witchcraft interests and such around his house.
Yeah.
I mean, it blows my mind, because I had no idea Elton John was into it too,
Yeah.
And
it just goes so deep, man. It goes so deep. It's incredible.
I like that you were able to add a section about Bowie's death in there.
Yeah, I did, because I was.
He's a peculiar character.
Yeah, I was in the finishing stages of the book in January. And just as it was about to be typeset, David Bowie, rather inconveniently and inconsiderately, went and bloody died. So
on his birthday, right?
Or did he? That's a whole thing.
Yeah, that's kind of like the avenue I want to start exploring, is if he really died, because I was talking with Jay Dyer yesterday, and I guess he died on his birthday, and I was curious.
Well, it was 2 days after, I think.
Oh, 2 days after, okay. And it was curious that he releases an album. I mean, he releases an album every few years. Like he's stayed pretty relevant. But he did just release an album that shot to #1 the second he died. And it's not far from Bowie's kind of mode of operation to maybe play a prank on us like that. And in his final video, it kind of suggests that he's been ascended into some kind of higher form of occultism.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's the Black Star video, of course, and the song Lazarus, which appeared on that Black Star album. And researchers have done acres of analysis into all the dark symbolism that's involved in that. There's a great piece on Vigilant Citizen that goes into it. But for me, the most fascinating aspect of the story that we got of Bowie dying back in January was, I don't know if you guys saw this, but on Sky News, which we got here in the UK, the morning after Bowie had apparently died, on this Sky News bulletin, they wheeled out this character by the name of Jack Stephen. Are you familiar with this?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Well, they wheeled out this guy who was said to be a long-standing music executive, and he's said to have been involved in A&R for various artists over the course of the last 45 years. And he was the CEO of a company called Fortress Music in London. And Fortress Music certainly does exist. You can check that out. And Jack Stephen was presented as an A&R guy that used to know Bowie and had extensive dealings with him in the industry over the years. And the most striking thing that people found very unsettling is the fact that Jack Stephen bore a very, very striking similarity to David Bowie. Now, David Bowie is quite a distinctive-looking dude. You know, he's quite an unusual-looking guy. And so when somebody looks like him, it tends to stand out. And this guy, Jack Stephen, he didn't have the two differently coloured eyes, but his facial features were very similar to that of Bowie. And we were told that this guy had been in the industry since 1970. He'd started his first company in 1970. Now, to have started a company, I would have thought you'd have to be at least 20 years old. Probably older, but I would have thought 20 is about the minimum age. So if you started a company in 1970, you were born in 1950, which means that you're now 65 or 66 years of age. Now, the character that they wheeled out as Jack Stephen looked nowhere near 65 or 66 years of age to me, unless he'd undergone a lot of plastic surgery and was wearing a hairpiece, which he may have been. And a lot of people have said, well, you know, this Jack Stephen does really exist. This is ridiculous. And yes, it would appear that he does really exist because there is another video of him on the internet dating back to 2010, which I've been able to find. But the character that is presented as Jack Stephen in the 2010 video looks completely different to the Jack Stephen that was wheeled out on Sky News in January in tribute to David Bowie. And in this interview that they're doing with him, he says, "When I got the news, it was as if a little piece of me had died." And you've got to wonder if this is another aspect of those that are controlling things, messing with our minds and giving us little tantalising snippets to raise our curiosity and sort of place aspects of the truth in plain sight. So a lot of people have speculated on whether David Bowie did in fact die and whether he might still be around, who this Jack Stephen individual is, why he looks so different to what he used to. You know, I can't say for sure what happened, and I'm not going to come out and make any bold claims about this one because I can't prove it. And if I can't prove something, I don't like to come out and say that it was definitely the case. But by the same token, you get people... I mean, with the Paul McCartney thing, for instance, I can't come out and say for definite that a replacement took place. I can say that all of the evidence points to the fact that it did, but I can't actually prove that it did. And so somebody saying, that's bollocks, that's rubbish, it can't possibly be true, they can't prove that it didn't take place. You know, the absence of proof is always there. So that's why it's so difficult to come out and make bold claims about these things, unless you can absolutely prove it one way or the other. So, you know, with this whole David Bowie thing, I can't say what went on there, but anything seems possible. And many are speculating on the fact that perhaps he didn't die, perhaps his public persona was retired and he's slinked off into the background somewhere. I mean, we've heard this before. We've heard this with Elvis. There were claims that Elvis faked his death. There's a writer by the name of Miles Mathis who's done some very detailed work to suggest that John Lennon faked his death and is actually still alive and is actually still performing as a musician under the name of Mark Stacer. If people want to go to milesmathis.com, they can find his very comprehensive essay on that subject. And we've heard it with Tupac as well, haven't we, mate? I mean, people say Tupac didn't really die. So, and also Michael Jackson.
All the like most prolific kind of entertainers kind of get this persona of something bigger than just their earthly kind of life.
Yeah.
And you did a good job in the book, since you just mentioned Miles Mathis, because I've been on that website as well doing some research on Sharon Tate. In the book, you do a great job of showing us the names of the researchers, where you got the information, where you can get more information. I mean, you did a bang-up job on this book. I mean, I can't recommend it highly enough to people who even if you're a beginner in this thing, even if you're knowledgeable of this thing, there's like something for everyone. And, kudos for that, man.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I've included huge resource sections at the end of each chapter. And it's intended to show that, if anyone's reading this book or is hearing this interview and they think, I'm just one individual that's ranting and raving and spouting off some crazy ideas I've dreamt up in my head. The resource section is there to show that actually I'm not the only one saying this, and I'm not the only person that's looked into this. And actually most of what I put across in the book is based on other researchers' work. I'm picking up on things that they've put out there, and I'm either representing their work or I'm developing points that they've raised. But either way, there are a vast number of researchers that have looked into all these subject areas before. And the resource section is there for people that want to look at other people's perspectives on these subjects and see that, they've come to similar conclusions, and that actually this information is very widespread. There are many, many YouTube videos. There are many books that have been written on this subject. There are many blog articles. And I try to direct people to those because I want people to look at other researchers' work and get a full appreciation of what all these subject areas involve. So that was a very important part of it, just to show that it's not just one guy and his crazy theories.
Right. That's the beauty of this kind of, like I talked about earlier in scientific theory. There's this idea of evolving a theory until something critical happens, and then it's a revolution. And when you write the book like that, because I try to do that kind of thing as well. We're taking other theorists' theories and findings, applying them, and then trying to elaborate on them a little bit further, kind of pushing the envelope as far as it'll go. And I think over time, with the advent of the internet, it's quite possible we can come to a final truth and a final revelation that kind of blows the lid off the thing someday, and we hit that revolution moment. But for now, all you can do is try to present the evidence in a rational way. And obviously, like you said, the media isn't going to spread this message, so it's up to us to kind of wake each other up. And I think you did a great job in doing that in this book. So congrats on that.
I mean, we have a responsibility to truth. When you come across truthful understandings, you have a responsibility to convey that to others once you've gone through a period of assimilating it in your own mind and understanding how it all fits into the big picture. Once you have that, once you've grasped that, you take on an obligation to communicate it to others. It's not enough to just sit on that information yourself, fascinating as it may be to look at all this stuff and turn it over in your own mind. There comes a point where, because we're dealing with some pretty devastating stuff here, which has repercussions for the whole of humanity, it's not over dramatic to say that, because that is really what it boils down to. The dark occult priest class that are running the show, that control the music industry and all your favourite artists in it, along with everything else in the world, have some very severe and very malevolent plans for the whole of humanity and for people listening to this and for their children. And so it's absolutely vital that people pay attention to this, because us writing it off as rubbish, as impossible, as fantasy, is exactly the kind of reaction that they rely upon. You're playing right into their hands when you won't even look at the information. You just think, it sounds ridiculous, it can't possibly be true. They love you and your type because you're exactly the type of individual that's easy for them to control. And as long as that mindset pervades in society, then the agenda continues, and we get driven down this very dark road that they've got planned for us. So, you really do owe it to yourself, anyone listening to this, to at least look at the information that's being presented by not just me, but many, many other people out there. And a point I want to make, Isaac, is the fact that I'm doing this reluctantly, to be honest with you. I don't really want to be doing this. There are other things that I would rather be doing with my life. When I think back 10 years ago, I was a DJ, I was on the radio, I was doing gigs, I was traveling around the world, I was loving life, I was having fun, I was enjoying the music, I was blissfully ignorant of all this dark stuff that's going on in the world. But I got led to it, and I came to those understandings, and now I realise that I'm obliged to do whatever I can to communicate this information to people, as everyone is when they come to it. But I would prefer that this wasn't the case. I don't want all these artists to be controlled in the way they are. I don't want all this occultic, satanic imagery to get put into videos. I don't appreciate the way so-called hip-hop has gone, the way it's become degraded, and the lyrics are all garbage, and it's so retarded now, the whole thing. I wish it was different. I wish it was another way. I wish I didn't have to put this book out. I would prefer not to. Because people say, oh, you just love being controversial. The reason you do this is because you like being rebellious. It's not the case. There are so many other things I'd prefer to be doing. People think that researchers in this line of work do it because they find conspiracies exciting and titillating and it gets some attention. They're attention seekers. And that's not the case. Certainly not the case with me. So,
right, I concur with that, because when I first started, I was one of those that found the theories fun and interesting, and I still do to an extent, but when you start digging in and you start accepting that this thing is happening, it starts to become kind of a dark monster that you've looked at it in the eye, and now you can't go back. And
it's a bit more than a hobby.
Right, it kind of consumes you, and you got to be careful because you have to balance your personal life out. Because you're like myself. We've both got our own thing going on besides this kind of conspiracy persona.
Yeah.
And when I was researching for my Charles Manson book, for instance, I feel like that touches in on some kind of source of evil, because I constantly start it, and I've got to just unplug from the thing and take a step back, because I'll start getting these crazy nightmares and just weird kind of evil presence.
Yeah, that can very easily happen.
And you kind of, and speaking of Manson, I feel like the 60s was a pivotal moment in this whole agenda that kind of took it to another level. And you make some interesting points about Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and you talk about it being a reference to Lucifer. Is that right?
Well, other researchers have suggested that Lucy is connected with the word Lucifer, as is Lucas, when you get down to that particular name, as in George Lucas. And you get into all kinds of synchronistic and synchromystic links, particularly with that late 60s period, which, like you, I find absolutely fascinating. And if I could get in a time capsule and go back to any particular point in time and witness it, I would probably choose the late 60s, because I just missed it. But I think to have been in Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, or Laurel Canyon, Los Angeles, between sort of 1965 and 1969 would have been an absolutely fascinating experience, because you had the explosion of LSD on the scene, and it coincided with the sort of hippie movement that emerged at that time, and the whole counterculture, anti-establishment aspect of society. And then there was lots of talk of the age of Aquarius at that time, with the musical Hair that came out in 1969, with the song talking about Aquarius. And there seemed to be lots of... And then there was a whole Charles Manson thing, the Manson family murders. And there were all these kind of metaphysical, spiritual, dark occult connections with those times. And it fed into the music, because all the music started to get psychedelic around that time. The music of the Beatles changed from sort of 1966 onwards. And then you had all that scene coming out of Laurel Canyon with the Doors and Frank Zappa and Mamas and the Papas and all that stuff. And again, there's loads of synchronistic links there, because Charles Manson crops up everywhere. It's just like Aleister Crowley. When you get into the backstory of the US industry, Manson ties into the Beach Boys, and there's links to the Beatles track Helter Skelter. And then there's synchronistic links there with the paedophile film director Roman Polanski, and particularly his movie Rosemary's Baby, which was all about high-level Satanism. And I would suggest is a metaphor for what really goes on in the world, presented to us as a fictional movie, but in actual fact, once again, placing the truth in plain sight about what really goes on. And, links to John Lennon and Mia Farrow's linked up in that whole thing. And yeah, it's just incredible, man. That was just a fascinating period. And again, there are links to military intelligence when you really get down to it as well, because people can look back at that period and they can consider it to have been organic and grassroots and something that just developed by itself. The hippie movement just came out of young people expressing themselves and wanting to put themselves out there that way, and people think that LSD just was part of that whole liberation, that whole process of emancipation that was going on at the time. But then you get down to the study of it, and you get down to the fine detail, and you get into who Timothy Leary was, this LSD guru that was presented as this free-thinking, liberal, maverick kind of individual that came out of academia and gave young people LSD as a means of exploring their spirituality and stuff. That's the cover story. But, you get into it and you come to discover that Timothy Leary was an asset of the CIA. And he actually stated that himself on a number of occasions later in his life. So if Timothy Leary was working for the CIA or in league with them, how natural was that whole explosion of LSD? And you get into this guy called Ken Kesey, who was the author of the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was later made into a movie with Jack Nicholson. And that story was set in a kind of experimental mind control institution. And then you discover that Ken Kesey was a product of a sort of mind control experiment himself, came out of those laboratories, and he used to cruise around California in this psychedelic coloured bus. And his troupe was known as Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. And he was out there distributing tabs of acid free to all the young kids that were congregating in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco and other areas. And that all tied in with the way the music was changing at the time. And then, of course, you get into the research of Dave McGowan, the wonderful researcher and author, who unfortunately passed away on the 22nd of November last year. I'm sure that date will have raised the interest of many people, 22/11, being the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. But unfortunately, Dave McGowan passed away last year after he'd contributed this incredible work looking into the backgrounds of many of the musicians, the prominent musicians that came out of the Laurel Canyon area of Los Angeles in that whole counterculture era. And I'm sure you're familiar with the story, Isaac, but he goes into the military and intelligence backgrounds of the fathers of pretty much every prominent and pivotal artist that came out of that scene and shaped the way that the music industry went in those years, at the tail end of the 60s. The classic example is the father of Jim Morrison of The Doors. And McGowan uncovered the fact that he was a Navy admiral. And he was actually on deck on the fleet of ships that were involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which springboarded the US into its ground war in Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War. So you have the father of this supposed rebellious maverick creative rock star who happens to be a high-level military naval commander. And then you get people like Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa is viewed similarly as Morrison as this, wildly expressionate creative artist from that era. But it turns out that Frank Zappa's father was involved in chemical weapons research, bioweapons, working out of the Edgewood Arsenal. And you get into the background of all the other key characters from that scene, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and Buffalo Springfield and Captain Beefheart and Joan Baez, and it ties into the Eagles and the Beach Boys. And, McGowan's research has shown that there are always links to military intelligence or the security services in some way. And it just raises the question of how natural and organic that whole scene, that whole aspect of society was, or whether it was in fact a cynically concocted exercise in mind control and social engineering from all these different laboratories and think tanks all tied into military intelligence. It's absolutely fascinating. It's also devastating for anyone that remembers that era with fond nostalgia. I totally understand that it's devastating for people to come across the suggestion that it may all have been manufactured and it may all have been designed to capture young people's minds and perceptions and steer them off down a certain path and keep them away from engaging themselves in certain other things and becoming anti-war activists and whatever, just getting them all high on LSD and listening to tripped out music instead. Of course, it's devastating for anyone to have to accept that when they've got nostalgia invested in those years. But again, it's not a story that I would choose to tell. I'm just telling it because it's there to be told, and I'm someone that likes to put truthful information into the world the best I understand it. The facts are there, the evidence is there, the information is there. McGowan left a great legacy behind in his work, which has been hugely revelatory to many people. And you need to look at it and make of it what you will, but it is what it is, and truth is always truth.
McGowan's kind of like most of us theorists, where they juggle a day job with this side hobby, and you feel like it becomes less of a hobby and more of a duty.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, he also worked until his last days. But in the book, you go through the whole 60s movement, which is definitely a period where they started experimenting with this control with MK Ultra and the such.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned, there's lots of connections with the military. I think you mentioned Frank Zappa. I've read in Adam Gorightly's book about Manson, how he was tied into this house where the stairway was, this spiral staircase, which is where Manson and his family picked up the first source of evil. That's from Manson's own words. But yeah, there's something with the Laurel Canyon area, with Hollywood being the magician's wand, obviously. But in the book, you also take us through to more modern influences, particularly hip hop.
Yeah.
There's predictive programming. You talk about some transhumanism as well. And in fact, I had to laugh when I read one of your sections. You're talking about Beyonce and the Single Ladies song that she had, and you call it the Singularity Ladies, which is appropriate.
Yeah, exactly.
Those of you who are familiar with the singularity and the technological advances that Ray Kurzweil promises to usher in, you'll get that pun. If not, read the book. It's humorous. And there's tons more in this book. We've got some of the Satanism stuff, Aleister Crowley, of course.
Yeah.
And you've elaborated on the blood sacrifice section. You brought up because I'm into hip hop as well, and there's the connections with Guru and Solar from Gangstar that I wasn't aware of. So again, man,
I really wanted to get into that one because actually a lot of the stuff in that section where I get into ritual sacrifice and to a certain extent demonic possession, all these good family friendly subjects, all the stuff to read to the kids at night.
Light reading.
Only joking. It's a lot of that stuff I got from your book, man. I mean, sacrifice magic behind the mic. I've actually quoted you a few times in those sections.
I saw that, thanks.
Yeah, I lifted some aspects of your book to help make some of those points because I learnt a lot from reading your book, particularly when it got into the stuff with Lisa Left Eye Lopez, and some of the strange sort of voodoo type witchcraft connections to her time in Honduras. I found that very interesting, and going into some of the stuff with Aaliyah and many other artists. But the Guru and Solar thing is very much the forgotten story when it comes to strange hip-hop deaths. People have spent years analysing the circumstances behind Biggie and Tupac, and people get into what happened with Jam Master Jay and Old Dirty Bastard even. I know you mentioned him in your book, and I've referenced that. But you hardly ever hear anyone talking about Guru and Solar. And this is pretty devastating in itself because Guru was one of my favourite hip-hop artists, one of my favourite MCs. He was a very gifted lyricist, and he made some very potent observations in many of his lyrics. I just loved his flow and his overall tone and his overall feel, as many hip-hop heads did. He was
an iconic voice. It was unmistakable.
He was a real heads favourite. You speak to hip-hop purists, and most of them loved Guru. And the stuff he put forward on Moment of Truth, the lyrics on that track Moment of Truth, were just absolutely bang on the point. And he also put out a track called Conspiracy back in the early 90s, where he's talking about this malevolent control over the music industry, and specifically this agenda to subjugate black people and to degenerate black culture. And I go into that in a whole chapter as well. There seems to be a particular war on black people and their culture and their heritage. And there's been great efforts taken to suppress that and just degrade it and, completely corrupt it. And I go into some ways in which that is done. But it was very upsetting for me to hear of the demise of Guru, because it happened in very strange circumstances. He got ill and he slipped into a coma. And for many weeks in hospital, he was just lying in this comatose state. And a short while before that, there was this character that had come onto his radar by the name of Solar, super producer, his words, not mine, Solar. Not to be confused with MC Solar, the French hip-hop MC. But this guy was just Solar, real name John Mosher. And Guru used to work with DJ Premier, and they were the group Gangstar, together with Big Shug. And the story goes that Guru had a falling out with DJ Premier some years before. And so Solar then drifted into Guru's camp and became his producer and started working on his Jazzmatazz albums with him. And the two were very much a pairing in the industry. But there were some strange stories that started to emerge after some time, where Solar seemed to have some kind of mind control hold over Guru's behaviour. And you'd hear people talk about things like they'd have an interview scheduled with Guru, and Solar would turn up. And Guru would just sit there, and Solar would answer all the questions for him. And then Solar would decide it's time to leave, and he'd cut the interview short. And he seemed to be just completely dictating Guru's behaviour and completely controlling every aspect of what he did. And after Guru had slipped into this coma, there were stories, again I can't prove it, but I'm just saying there were stories that Guru was dabbling into his financial affairs and sort of getting into his bank accounts, and there were stories that Solar was passing himself off as Guru on social media sites, and he was starting to chat up women pretending to be Guru, and it's just like he'd taken over his whole persona, And then there were stories from Guru's family, and I include some quotations from some of his family members, who said that Solar was actually blocking them from going to see Guru in hospital. And he claimed that Guru had written this letter signing all his affairs over to Solar, effectively, and saying that Solar was now in decision of everything that happened to his finances and his back catalogue and his music and who came to see him in hospital and all this stuff. And it was very, very strange. And Guru was, according to eyewitnesses, he grew this huge afro on his head. He used to keep his head slickly shaven, and his fingernails and toenails were allowed to grow, and he just looked like he was possessed and just in a terrible state. And all the time Solar had said that he was taking care of his brother Guru. And there was a website that came out called fucksolar.com. And it was a bunch of people that really wanted to try and pin the goods on this dude Solar, because they realised that there was some stuff going on behind the scenes, and they tried to gather evidence to get Solar, to answer for what he'd done and to bring him to justice. But Solar seemingly managed to get that website shut down and threatened legal action, got some lawyers on board, and got that whole thing to go away. And so Guru passed away in April 2010, and I don't think there was any official cause of death given, but it's all very strange. And so we're coming up on the 6th anniversary of that shortly. And it all very much seems to have been forgotten. Nobody seems to be asking questions about what went on anymore. Solar has drifted back into the background. I mean, as far as I can tell, he's not working in the industry. Nobody seems that enthusiastic at having this guy as their producer. And, Guru just is just that forgotten story that, way more questions than answers. So I just wanted to put a section in there to get people to remember Guru and to have a look at some of the strange circumstances surrounding his passing, because a lot of people think that there was some element of black magic or voodoo type ritualistic behaviour that was going on there, which would account for many of these strange aspects, and I don't discount that for a minute.
But you've got other artists on there that are of interest to most. We're talking Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison,
Yep.
John Lennon, Bob Marley, Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, Michael Hutchins, Amy Winehouse, and then of course Bowie. And the book goes on with the alter ego concepts, the Faustian bargains.
Yeah.
And you bring up a lot of rappers that I talked about Lauryn Hill as well in my book, and you covered her, but you also covered Lupe Fiasco, Jay Electronica.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of relevant material, and like I said before, it's nice that we can kind of build on each other's material and try to find something that resonates with the masses, with the public, so they can kind of jump in on this with us in trying to find the truth and revealing the deceptions that's out there.
Yeah. I mean, with the artists that you've just mentioned, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, John Lennon, Bob Marley, Michael Hutchins, another one that often gets forgotten. Very strange circumstances surrounding his death. That people are all hung up on Hendrix and Morrison, and quite rightly so. And people analyse what happened with those dudes for days. But there's lots to get into when you get into Michael Hutchins, and that ties into Bob Geldof, who's a very dark character when you get down to his true nature. And then I mentioned Michael Jackson and Amy Winehouse, and I added a section last minute on David Bowie. And I'm just going into some of the strange aspects behind their reported deaths and some of the stuff that led up to that point. All of it kind of a bit dark occultic and a bit mysterious and a bit metaphysical in nature, because these links are always there. And then, as you say, I'm bringing it up to date with the hip-hop scene. I'm talking about some of the unusual aspects of Jay Electronica. And again, drawing on some other researchers' work, but questioning whether this dude is all that he's presented to us as, or whether there's more to know about where he came from. And also the nature of this strange relationship that he had with Kate Rothschild, a Rothschild heiress, a representative of one of the key bloodlines that are always cited when it comes to Illuminati and secret society stuff, and the Rothschilds are way up there and cited as one of the key bloodline families that are involved in this plot. So what the hell is this rapper who is presented again as this maverick, wildly creative and expressionate guy? What's he doing dating a Rothschild? And
I guess it ties us in because Jay-Z pretty much founded Jay Electronica, and that ties Jay-Z's Rockefeller rock label with perhaps the real Rockefellers and the Rothschilds there.
Well, that's right. I mean, why did Jay-Z name his record label Rockefeller in the first place? These things are never done by accident. There's always symbolic clues as to what's going on. And I think nobody that's paying attention can be under any doubt of the fact that Jay-Z is absolutely controlled and manipulated. And I mean, he's a Freemason. It's on record that he is. That's not even deniable. But all throughout his work, there have been clues of the degree to which he's being absolutely puppeteered. This was a difficult one for me. I was talking earlier about how people that remember the 60s have a very hard time taking on board what you might say about the Beatles, and the suggestion that the Beatles might have been a product of the Tavistock Institute, or the suggestion through Dave McGowan's work that the whole Laurel Canyon movement was manipulated and controlled from higher sources. I can understand why people find it so difficult to accept that, because I've said many times before that it was like that with me and Jay-Z. Going back to when I first became a DJ and first got into hip-hop and all that, I thought Jay-Z was amazing, awesome, great lyricist, and I followed his work, and I looked up to him. And it was only when I came to discover his true nature and what he's being used for and the agenda that he's a part of that respect diminished. I can't respect anyone that is a part of that agenda anymore, no matter how awesomely talented and great skills they may have. I can't respect someone that is a part of that. And so it's something that I've had to come to an acceptance of. And it was a difficult process, but, you're either going to go there or you're not. Same thing with Kanye West. I mean, it's been a source of great disappointment to me to see how Kanye West has degenerated from what he once was when he first emerged with his debut album to the clown that he now is, and the absolute garbage that he's putting out. Straight garbage.
Yeah, it is frustrating to see that kind of talent go to waste, especially with him getting involved with all of this TMZ type stuff and It's all just a show at this point.
Yeah, hooked up with Kardashian, yet another industry-arranged relationship.
Right, right. And then there's a show on FX channel out here about the O.J. Simpson trial. I don't know if you're watching it, but
No.
multiple times in this show, they talk about Robert Kardashian, the lawyer who is the father to Kim. And multiple times in the show, they make a point to show the kids, Kim and I don't know, Chloe and whatever. I'm like, geez, is there anything sacred here? Do we have to watch the Kardashians at all given times in our life? But,
yeah. Well, there's a section in the book where I reference all these interconnected bloodlines going back several generations, many, many centuries. And again, I can't prove this is the case, but I'm picking up on the work of another researcher that I found on the internet. And it is claimed, I'm sure you've heard this one before, it's claimed that many of the US presidents have had genealogical bloodline links to each other. There are claims that Barack Obama is actually genetically linked in a distant way to George H.W. Bush and, the whole Bush family. It's also claimed, although I think this is more factually provable, that David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, is genetically linked to the Queen of England. They're cousins, distant cousins. Prince William and Kate are actually distant cousins as well. They always keep it in the family. They like to interbreed all these elite types. And there's also claims that Kim Kardashian is linked in some way to David Cameron. And there are links. There are claims that Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister and mass-murdering psychopath, his wife Sherry Blair, her maiden name was Sherry Booth, and there are claims that she was actually descended from John Wilkes Booth, who is said to have assassinated Abraham Lincoln. And there are also claims that the British royal family are descended from Vlad Dracul, aka Vlad the Impaler of Transylvania, on who the Dracula legends are based. So, again, it's difficult to prove this, but it wouldn't surprise me if this turns out to be the case, because they do like to keep it within certain bloodlines, within certain families. You can talk to people like Jay Parker, who is a survivor of satanic ritual abuse. He came out of this Illuminati family going back many, many generations, where they subject their own kids to horrific traumas and, psychologically abuse their own children to bring about this psychopathic satanic mindset that we were talking about at the very start of this conversation, so that they can continue the work, but they can do it without all the capacities of humanity intact that the rest of us have. So they lack the compassion and the empathy and that connection with their innate humanity. That's why they do it. And Jay Parker talks about how they keep it within certain families, and certain bloodlines are very important to them, and they want to know where these descendants of certain bloodlines are at all points, at all times, so they can keep an eye on them. And that's why so many of them become celebrities and politicians and public figures, because they want to keep them in the public eye so that they can keep tabs on them, and also so that they can do some work for the agenda in terms of mind controlling the public and pushing certain social engineering agendas. So that's why we have people like Kim Kardashian and her like, who are famous for being famous. People often say, what the hell does she do? What does Paris Hilton do? Who are these people? Why are they even famous? Well, if you take on board the notion that certain bloodlines are important to them and that they want to keep tabs on where they are in the world, then you understand why all these pointless celebrities just pop up everywhere and why certain people become famous in spite of themselves.
Well, you did a wonderful job tying together a whole lot of material and theories, and you've researched it, you've laid it out in a cohesive manner that makes sense. It's an easy read. This is a fantastic book. It's called Musical Truth by Mark Devlin. It's available on Amazon.com. Is there anywhere else we can pick the book up?
Well, yeah, the primary source is Amazon. So for anyone listening in the US, the best way of getting hold of it is probably just to order a copy via Amazon. For anyone listening in the UK, I'm offering signed copies from my own personal stash. So I'm mailing them out myself. I'm pretty much only doing that in the UK just because of the postage costs and the difficulties and, issues with customs and such. But if anyone wants to hit me up for a copy to be mailed out in the UK, they're welcome to drop me an email, and they can email me on mark@markdevlin.co.uk. There's further information about the book at musicaltruthbook.com. And if anyone just wants to drop me an email to find out about alternative sources, I know not everyone likes Amazon. There are some other retailers that it's going through. So if anyone wants to drop me an email on that address, I answer all emails received, and I'll be grateful for any feedback or any comments that people have about what's in the book. Always happy to engage in correspondence with people. And I'm also doing a speaking tour. I'm just trying to get out to certain events, and I'm taking quantities of the book with me to each of those. I am coming to the US for the Free Your Mind conference, as I mentioned. That takes place in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia, and it's over the weekend of the 15th to the 17th of April. I'm doing a quick talk there, and I'll have copies of the book on a merchandise table there. You can get further information and tickets at freeyourmindconference.com. And all my other talks are pretty much in Europe. But looking forward to get out there for that one. And as I say, anything else is all at musicaltruthbook.com.
So there you have it, Mark Devlin, Musical Truth, now available on Amazon and elsewhere. Pick up the book. I assure you it's a great read, especially if you've read my hip-hop conspiracy book, Sacrifice Magic Behind the Mic. This will also expand your interest and levels of knowledge in the occult and the music industry. I really appreciate Mark's passion for the subject. I've been on his podcast called Good Vibrations, and he's actually also got a series of interviews worth checking out, and he has a show called The Sound of Freedom where he plays some more conscious hip-hop music. He's really got a lot of great stuff. If you go to just Google search for DJ Mark Devlin, spelled D-E-V-L-I-N, Mark is spelled M-A-R-K, and you'll find his website where you can get information on all of these subjects. Or if you're ready to get the book, just Google search for Musical Truth by Mark Devlin. Should show up for the Amazon listings. And as one final petition, I'd like to mention that I do this podcast free of charge. I don't bug you with ads about stamps and shaving creams and all that other nonsense, because I want to give back to the listeners, because I appreciate all the time that you guys spend watching my YouTube videos or reading my articles, and I can just appreciate that we can connect with like-minded people. So if you want to get publicity for the show, you can go to iTunes or Stitcher and post a review or a rating, because that helps get the message out and other people can listen to it. But I wanted to thank you for listening to the show, and public speaking isn't my strongest suit, but I do the best I can. So I just wanted to tell you I appreciate you listening to the show. Thanks.